I am really excited to have Sam here today, Dr. Cheng, who, she'll talk more about her whole career path, but we met in grad school. We both did our PhDs at UCLA, and we both went to Indonesia to do field work together during our summers in grad school. And so I'm very familiar with these handfuls of squid that Sam would go to the market to collect and sequence their DNA to figure out, how they're all related to each other and whether there's more than one species. So that is what I'm most familiar with her work, but now she's really broadened out and is working more on more global conservation research. Oh, we have another student joining. So yeah, we are going to hear all about it from Sam. Why don't you take it away?
Sounds good. Thanks, Allison. Hi, everyone. Thanks for hanging out today during your lunchtime. I hear that there are some presentations happening next week, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your week to come hang out, learn a bit about squid, learn a bit about conservation, and a bit about what it's like to work at a large conservation nonprofit. So since we're a small group, I won't spend too much time, flicking through slides, just some photos to share. And then I'm happy to answer any questions about really anything moving forward. So just to start, as Allison said, I work for the World Wildlife Fund. This is a large conservation nonprofit, and I work for the Global Science team as the Director for Conservation Evidence. So part of what I wanted to talk to you all about today is how do you go from studying squid to working in global science? What is global science? What's evidence? And just to give you all a bit of a picture into what that's like. Okay, so a bit about WWF. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this logo. People like to call it the panda. But what WWF is, it's a large international nonprofit that consists of a network of offices all over the world. And what all these offices are trying to do is to work to create a world where people and nature have a very harmonious, sustainable, and thriving relationship. So that means there are offices everywhere. So I work for the Global Science Office, which works really across every office, which is a little daunting when you think about it, but we're hosted by the US. So I'm here in Portland, Oregon. Our office is in DC. And where WWF works really is looking at different types of ecosystems, forests, freshwater, and oceans, but also looking at different components of those that happen across all ecosystems, right? So we work to protect and conserve wildlife and habitat for wildlife across these ecosystems. We work to address climate change and the impacts of climate change and to mitigate climate change, as well as looking at the food systems that drive the world, right? So our fisheries, our agriculture, the way that this food gets to us, sustainable planetary diets, all of this comes under the auspices of where we work. So as I mentioned, so what exactly is global science then? So the global science team is this team of scientists with all different backgrounds and all different levels of expertise and focus areas. And we work across the entire network. And our job is to ensure that how we conserve biodiversity, how we address habitat degradation, how we address climate change, how we address human well-being are all based in the best available science, evidence, and knowledge. So my job within this organization is across all of the areas where we work is to help people understand how do we actually measure and understand what we're doing, the impact of what we're doing, and then how do we learn from that in order to ensure that the way that we protect a forest or the way that we protect the ocean is actually working, and adjust it as time goes on. So I haven't really talked about squid yet. I promise I'll get to the squid. I promise there might be videos of squid later. But this is where I work, right? So my focus has always been in marine conservation, but it really does span everything these days. And I'm really interested in trying to understand how nature and people are linked, right? So if we improve and that natural ecosystem, how does that help people? If we improve the way that we get food, how does it help the ecosystem? So how do we ensure that there's a good balance between, this entire planet that we work in, we live in, and then how do we make sure that we use scientific evidence, we use knowledge from local communities, we use the knowledge that people have gathered, over their lifetimes to inform how we make these decisions, whether it's, where we're going to plant a tree to the types of policies that governments are pursuing. So all this started when I was small in Boston, Massachusetts, but I realized the star has moved. I think in some formatting error, things kind of moved around. So I grew up in Boston, and I grew up going to aquariums, lots and lots of aquariums. I loved them. When I was young, I went to the Monterey Bay Aquarium with my parents, and apparently I cried because I wasn't allowed to sleep there because I just wanted to sleep by the tank. Maybe a strange child. And what I ended up doing when I was in high school was working at the aquarium as a volunteer with the education department. And it was not as glamorous as what I imagined. I was like, I'm gonna be diving, and sitting at the touch tank, talking about animals. I was the person outside in the shark costume in the summertime when people were stuck in line because, it was a very popular place to go. And I would come up to people and be like, hey, do you want to learn a fun fact about sharks? It was very sweaty. We had like pockets for the ice packs to keep us cool. I also dressed up as a penguin. So if you ever were at the aquarium, probably potentially before you're all born, but that was me. But it really instilled this love of the ocean. And I kind of always had in the back of my mind that this is something that I wanted to do more of. So after high school, I went to college in Southern California at a place called Scripps College. This is a women's college that's part of the Claremont University Consortium. It's a small school, about 1,000 students. 250 people per class. It was smaller than my high school. I was a little bit like, what crazy thing am I doing here? But when I was in college, and this is just an excuse to share pictures of Scripps because I think it's a beautiful, beautiful place. I really didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to do conservation, and then I started taking all these classes and all sorts of things, right? And in the women in Islam, in literature, in one point a class about the history of baseball, and classes in economics or classes in politics. And I just kept changing my major. I was like, I think I'm interested in this. I think I'm interested in this. And then ultimately, I did end up having a major in biology, but having taken all of these classes in all these different topic areas with a focus in conservation and how we manage natural resources. And when I left college, I was a little bit like, all right, I finished college. I have a college degree. Woohoo! What do I want to do? I want to have fun. And I was trying to figure out what I want to do. And I had the luck to get a Fulbright scholarship. And this is a program that's run by the US State Department. And it funds students post-college to go either teach English in another country or to do research in another country and try and, really ground yourself in a new place, meet new people, learn about what's going on, and really try and get a bigger picture of the world around us. And so I went to Bali, and in Bali, I worked on a marine conservation project, looking at marine biodiversity and trying to understand the genetic diversity of not squid yet, but of mantis shrimp. And during that time, I worked with a lot of Indonesian students at the universities, who were around the same age, either in undergrad or just finished undergrad. Figuring out, what do we know about Indonesian biodiversity, and how does this intersect with Indonesian society and Indonesian culture? And when I got to the end of my Fulbright, I was living in Indonesia. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, and pretty much at that point, I was like, well, I could stay here and be a dive master, or just kind of bum around on the beach, which, to be honest, sounded like a really great idea. Or I was like, maybe I should go to grad school and I should use this research that I've been doing for the past year and a bit to a degree. And so I did, and I applied to grad school with my advisor, who I'd been working with for the past few years, and went to UCLA, where I met Allison. Um, and here is when I really started to dig into the science of it all, right? Because I'd always been interested in conservation, but in all these different parts of it. And in grad school, that was a time I could really focus it and try and understand, well, what is it that I'm really excited about marine biodiversity? And that question was, how do we use these genetic tools and understanding of biodiversity to actually inform the way we manage marine systems, the way we conserve marine biodiversity, the way we manage fisheries? I'm not going to go into my research today. It seems boring, to be perfectly honest. So instead, I'm just going to show you what life in grad school was kind of like. And I think this experience is different for everyone, right? For us, it was a lot of diving and fruitlessly looking for squid. I think in this case, a lot of it was going to fish markets and talking to people who are fishing for squid, people who are selling squid, people who are processing squid, about what they are observing about changes to the marine environment and changes to the squid populations, and collecting a lot of those tissue samples so that we could do the genetic analysis. There was a lot of working with people from all over the world. This is the team from Japan, Taiwan, the US, and then myself. And looking on a expedition, looking for all sorts of different things, looking for pygmy squid, looking for blennies, these little fish that live symbiotically with shrimp, and then looking for squid eggs for me for these. So what I was really interested in was trying to understand how many different species of squid there were, which ones were being fished, and then how we could use information about their populations over space, geographic space, and over time, to understand where we fish, how many fish we catch, or how many squid we catch, in order to make sure that squid populations stick around. And it wasn't always fun, to be honest. There were lots of times that we were on boats in the pouring rain. In this case, it was raining so hard that everyone had to protect their faces from the rain that was just going straight into their eyeballs. And a lot of that was working in lots of different conditions, looking for squid at night, looking for squid during the day, looking for squid on the shore, looking for squid in the fish market, looking for squid in the sea. And what I really learned when I was in grad school was this importance of collaboration, right? And so none of this would have been possible if I didn't have the opportunity to work with lots of different students, lots of different researchers in Indonesia. Here we're in the western tip of Sumatra, in Banda Aceh, with students from the university in Banda Aceh. And we're looking at different measurements of the growth of squid that were coming in, to try and understand, how big they were, how often they were coming in. And oftentimes this was smelly. It was smelly and slimy work. We're on a porch somewhere because we've been relegated out of the house because it smelled, and it's raining, and we're trying our best. But these are collaborations that not only helps further the research, but also help build capacity of students, myself and the students we were working with. And of course, we ate a lot of squid. Because what do you do with all those squid samples that you collect? You can't throw them away because that would be a waste. So you end up eating squid in all shapes and forms. There's I don't even know, grilled squid, boiled squid, maybe on the top, and some fried squid. We had stewed squid. We had squid in all forms. Allison clearly remembers a lot of this. And then of all those samples that we collected, we brought them back to the lab. And so that grad school really was a split between the field work and then the lab work, to try and collect the data and understand what's going on, and make sure that we have good information moving forward. So how does this relate back to conservation then? So when I was in grad school, one of the things that I quickly came to realize was that, as exciting as genetic data was, as exciting as the observations we were making about squid populations were, that wasn't enough to inform how we actually make decisions in conservation. A lot of it's about politics, right? Fisheries are a really valuable industry. So there is a lot of political pressure to make decisions in certain ways, but also to consider what people value, right? And the fact that fisheries provide a significant source of income and jobs, and a sense of identity in many places. Um, Sometimes the genetics tells us that we need to manage a fishery in a completely different way, in a way that's not even feasible because a system isn't set up that way. The government isn't set up that way. The people who are in charge aren't set up that way. Um, and it's not just that genetic data, right? We need to make sure that we are incorporating the information that people held in from their experience. These ladies who are selling squid. I mean, one of those ladies I remember was just like, "Oh, you silly scientist." You're trying to figure out stuff that we could tell you all sorts of things about the patterns that we're seeing here. So finding ways to be able to combine that biological data, the ecological data with the social and the local knowledge is really important. And so that led me to this sort of change in my career path, or this evolution. So really starting to ask, well, what information do we actually need to inform the decisions we want to make in conservation? And most importantly, once we've done that, how do we know that what we're doing is actually working, right? Like, I think we see a lot of stuff on the news, and in life, right? It's been really hot. We see the impacts of habitat degradation. We see the impacts of climate change. So we want to make sure that what we're actually doing in conservation is addressing those things and doing it in a way that's effective. I'm gonna maybe skip over a little bit of these in the detail, because I want to have a conversation with you all about this. But where my work is now is trying to understand these links, right? So we have these really lofty goals at the global level that are defined by the UN, that are defined by large bodies like the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. But what all these goals are really asking us to strive for is a harmonious relationship between nature, people, and climate. But if we want to make progress towards that, we need to make sure what we're doing is informed by the science that's out there, by the knowledge that's out there, in a way that ensures that what we're doing is working. So at WWF, what does this look like? So conservation evidence under, I guess, sort of the auspices of our team really focuses on three things. The first is that how we measure what's happening and how we measure the impact of the work that we're doing is really robust. It's grounded in, really scientifically valid methods. It's grounded in local knowledge, and it's relevant, right, to the places where we're working. But it's also practical. I think sometimes, and I think you've also probably experienced this as you've been going through science classes, you've been going through designing experiments. You can design really, really exciting experiments, but they're kind of crazy sometimes to implement, right? It's like when I was in grad school, I was like, I'm going to collect squid from every place that they live so I can really understand what those populations look like. The squid I worked on lived on every ocean, every tropical and subtropical ocean in the world, except for the Atlantic. So, like, was I really going to be able to go to every single ocean and dive everywhere and go to every fish market? No. So really we need to be doing things in a way that's practical, because what's important is we collect the data. We understand at least something about what's going on. And that it's also collaborative. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're trying to work to be more collaborative, to make sure that we're including, diverse communities and really considering equity in how we design conservation, but also how we measure it. So how did I actually get into this? Because last we heard, I was just working on squid and then just hanging out with piles of dead squid and eating them. So when I was in grad school, I happened to meet somebody from Conservation International. And we were chatting about these questions, right? Like, how do we know what's working in conservation? And we came up with potentially what we thought was a great idea. We're like, we'll just, do a big literature review, and we'll just synthesize all of that information that's out there on the links between conservation and human well-being. And then we'll be done. We'll do it in a weekend. It'll be great. 3 years later, We finally finished it. It was 35,000 scientific papers that we had to go through. It was a little crazy, but the benefit of doing something like that is it helps us understand, right? What's the current state of our knowledge? Where do we have gaps in what we're researching? And where do we have a lot of information that can really help propel things forward? And you've all Google searched and tried to look for information before. It can be really time consuming. So for us working in conservation practice, it's we don't have a lot of times people just don't have the time. They don't have the time to go out and look for the information because it's everywhere. And so what synthesis can help do is help organize that. And so over the years, I've worked on lots of different syntheses and lots of different topic areas, from climate change to forest to democracy, and worked with a lot of different groups to help them figure out what do you do with that after we're done. And then the other area where I work now is not just in bringing the evidence together, but finding ways that we can do it more efficiently. So I mentioned that we read through 35,000 papers. It was painful. It was really painful. I was also finishing my PhD at the time, so that was also crazy. I don't think there was a lot of sleep happening. I would not recommend this to anybody. And so what we realized we needed was ways to harness computers and computer technology to help us do this better. So now what we have is a free tool called Colander that's online that uses machine learning, basically having the computer help us read and figure out what we want, what's relevant out of those piles and piles of papers. You'll see there's a theme about piles of stuff here, piles of squid, piles of papers, but also in figuring out how we help people dig into that information once we have it. So creating data platforms and different types of interactive graphics, like sometimes like the things you might see online in a news article where you can do little filters and see little parts of the data that are relevant for what you're interested in. That's some of the work that we're doing. But also creating collaborations, right, across organizations. They're all trying to do this. They're all trying to use evidence in different ways, and making sure people are learning and talking to each other, because that's really how we push things forward. And then speaking of collaboration, right, in the grand scheme of things, conservation isn't really about what we do. I think we hear about this a lot, right, in the news, like we need more protected areas, we need to plant more trees, we need to do this and this and this. But it's really about how we do it, right, to make sure it lasts and who's actually involved. Because you could go somewhere and like, imagine someone came to your front yard and planted a whole bunch of trees and you're like, oh, okay, thanks for asking. I wasn't really interested maybe in all of these trees, or maybe I was interested in a different type of tree, or maybe I have a different approach to, reducing urban heat or whatever it was. And so building those relationships and making sure that the people who, are on the ground where conservation is happening have a say in what's going on is really critical. And this is really, one of the biggest challenges, and I think something that's changing in marine science and coral reef science. So some coral reef scientists, colleagues, and I had gotten together some years ago, and we're sort of lamenting the fact that representation in coral reef science was still pretty rough. It was not very diverse, and it was creating cultures that were not supportive for people to stick around, especially diverse women of color, people of color, to stick around in coral reef science. And so we did some research just to figure out, because we like to dig into all of the papers, all the research that's out there. And we said, okay, well, of all the coral reef science research that's been published, who's actually publishing this? So in 2003, only 4% of people publishing in coral reef science were from non-OECD nations. So what's an OECD country? OECD countries are highly wealthy, economically stable countries around the world. So examples include the US, Australia, Western Europe, primarily. And so according to the research that we did, if you look at the trend and how representation has increased over the years, it's not until 2046 that we think that 50% of the people publishing coral reef science might be from these non-OECD nations. But the crazy thing is that most coral reefs around the world are not in OECD countries. They are in these non-OECD places, right? In Indonesia and Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean. When we look at gender, that also was not fantastic. So we saw that there were trends increasing for women in coral reef science, um, over the years, but it really is stagnated over the past 10 years or so, which is challenging. And there are lots of different challenges to that. And so one of the things that we're, as individual scientists, but also as institutions, is trying to create better support for women, for people of color in organization, so that they're supportive, that people will have the ability to engage in research, to engage in that knowledge production, and to really take part in this. Because, you know, I think the most striking trend that we found, and something that I think both myself and I think Allison and others that we worked with in grad school had really learned was, there are a lot of people who fly around the world to do research in other places, but they're not necessarily from there. And it takes away opportunities oftentimes from people who are researchers in that country to do research on their own ecosystems. And so our research showed that, most of the research that's done around the world is done by people who don't live there. And so there really is this push to try and build capacity and to make sure we provide opportunities for people in country to do the work and to research the places that they think are important, and that we're supportive of that. So I just wanted to wrap up a little bit because I just talked about a lot of stuff. I sort of skated over a lot of different things, but I started trying to draw. I was like, are there some themes here? Like, what happened over the years? And like, while this looks like a linear path, it really wasn't a linear path. I spent a lot of time in college hanging out by the pool and switching my major 7 million times because I was interested in everything. I studied abroad in Costa Rica. I forgot to mention that. That was fantastic. I figured out at the end of that I really didn't like forests. But then, crazy thing is later, 7 years later, I was like, oh, look, I'm working on a project on forests. So I guess my point here is, right, it's okay not to know what you want to do. There was a good amount of time when I was in my postdoc after grad school, and even when I was working at a university, as a director of a center, where I was like, what am I doing? People were like, wait, I'm sorry, you studied squid, but you also work in international development and like democracy. And I was like, yes. But I think what was really helpful for me, it was being able to constantly ask questions, right? There's always a question that I'm interested in. And the research skills that you learn, right? Like, okay, I have a question. How do I answer that question? What kind of data do we need? Where should we look? Those are all really key. And that really helped me sort of navigate working through all these different organizations, from a university to being a scientist at a museum, and now working at WWF. And and along the way, you meet a lot of really cool people that are fun to work with, and you figure out sort of what's exciting, and who you want to sort of collaborate with. And a brief plug. And I met Bill Nye, so I felt like I could retire at that point. I don't know why I'm still working. But in summary, right, what can we take away from this, or what I'd like you to take away from this? Really, I think my career path is an exercise in meeting a lot of really interesting people, collaborating with new people, being open to learning new things. Some of that was fun, and then also learning about what was awful. Like, I realized that I am awful at working at a university, and I really didn't want to work there. And learning that about yourself and being honest about it, and then remembering to also make the time for the things that you like to do besides the science, and obviously lots and lots of cats throughout the whole thing. So yeah, that's it. I'd love to chat with you guys. I see some things in the chat. If you want to email me, that's my email address, and Twitter, although I think I'm pretty boring on Twitter, to be honest. But now that I'm a panda, as people at WWF like to call themselves, I am still a squid. All right, let me, I'll leave this up for a second. But Allison, I don't know if you want, I'll turn it back to you.
The whole time. Love everything about that. Yeah, well, so last week we also had a small group, and I asked the students if they would go around and tell you a little bit about what they're working on this summer. So
Yeah.
you could all do that again this week. You can, if you can't unmute, if you're somewhere where there's too much noise, you could put it in the chat. But yeah, let's start with Margaret and Elena, since you've got your video on.
So we've kind of been working on like a lot of different projects, but this week we've been working, what is it exactly? It's like,
Well, we're working with fungi.
yeah.
Cool.
And specifically like decay fungi. So we're doing this like screening process, and the first few days this week we've just been like preparing media for it.
Has there been a favorite part of this process with the fungi?
We got to work on a project that was looking at like how creosote migrates away when like wood is treated with creosote, and how that migrates away from the wood, and that was pretty cool.
Like how it affects.
That's great.
Yeah.
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 Especially with lots of people treat woods for waterproofing in all sorts of ways, and some ways they're not great.
Yeah.
Mhm. Cool. How about Elise? You there?
Yeah. Hi. So my project is like, it surrounds microplastics and finding microplastics in like mangrove ecosystems. And so basically we're just taking like different parts of the mangrove, like the leaves, the props, the sediment like around it, and then digesting them with like chemical reactions, and then filtering them, and then looking at them under the microscope to see how many microplastics there are.
That's awesome. There's WF has some really interesting projects in microplastics that you might be interested in looking at. I will send them to Allison to forward along.
Cool.
And how about Zinnia? Oh yeah, so Zinnia says in the chat, can't use my mic, but I'm working with OHSU at the Oregon National Primate Research Center. My
Cool.
project focuses on how maternal age impacts fetal development. We also use a mouse model. So I think, and that's specifically in assisted reproductive technologies. So yeah, that's cool.
That's awesome.
Anyone have questions for Sam on their mind?
I'm gonna stop my screen share. Hold on. There we go. Oh, sorry, I've lost you all. Sorry, I'm okay.
We're here.
All right. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about whichever.
See some thinking. Why don't we start off by with my question for you, which is, what was it like going to a women's college?
Oh yeah. My mom thought I was crazy, admittedly. My mom went to an all-girls Catholic school until the end of high school, and she was just like, the nuns. And I had to remind her that I was like, well, I'm not going to a Catholic school, and there are no nuns. But I loved it, to be honest. So Scripps is on a campus with 4 other universities, which are co-ed universities. And what was really great about going to a smaller school is you really get to know everyone there. That can be a good thing or a bad thing. But it creates a really strong community. So like, some number of years now after we've graduated, there's always a Scripps network to lean on. Even when I was out in Indonesia, I would run into people and they'd be like, oh yeah, I was a Scripps College alum. Our real estate agent was a Scripps College alum, which we didn't figure out until afterwards. But I think one of the things that was really great about not just being at a women's college, but being at a liberal arts school is that I really got to explore like every interest that I might have, right? I had said like I took a class in the history of baseball because it seemed cool. But I could take classes, right, in biology and really dive in deep, right, in marine science and in ecology. But I could also take classes, a class I actually really remember was about the relationship between plants and people, and about how history really has been influenced by these natural resources, by things like that you wouldn't expect, right? Like tulips, for example, and by, things like agave for the production of tequila, and how that actually influenced the evolution of society, and like the way in which cuisines evolve, and how trade evolves, and all this other stuff that you just wouldn't really think of. And I think that actually really helped me pursue a career outside of just marine conservation, because by the time I got to like working in something about democracy, I was like, well, I do actually remember having to take classes in political science, and the stuff that I learned there was still relevant now. And being at a women's college, I think it depends on really your personality. It was really, like, not to stereotype, but the dorms were always really clean and quiet and nice, and it was kind of nice to be able to go back to your dorm after being at the other colleges and be like, oh, hey. But there are a lot of resources as well on campus to support that, and I think it certainly fosters a lot of individual sort of awareness about issues around gender, and then helps you, I think, figure out as you move along here how you can contribute. Not that you don't learn that in other places, but that was really like front and center part of being at a women's college. Plus, it has a great pool. If you were ever interested in Scripps College, I'm happy to chat.
Yeah, and that one's, Scripps is kind of unique in the sense that because it was on campus with the others, you still had classes with people in other colleges, right?
Yep. And we could use facilities at other colleges, and other people from other colleges could take classes at Scripps as well. So you're going to one school, but you have access to the courses and the communities at 5 schools.
Yeah. Any other
Are you all thinking about colleges now? I'm not sure at what stage we're at.
We've talked a lot about college stuff in some other meetings because it's mostly, rising seniors, juniors, sophomores. So yeah, it's that time.
This is not a question, but just a comment. I went on a tour last summer of Harvey Mudd. So
Oh yeah,
got to see Scripps a little bit.
oh nice. Beware, people like to watch Lord of the Rings loudly at night.
At least in 2006?
Yeah, in the early 2000s, that was happening. I remember leaving there. They had a much bigger gym than we used to, and so we would go there. And I remember leaving late one night, and it was quiet, and all of a sudden, like out of a dorm building, just blasted, "You shall not pass!" And I like jumped sideways, and I was like, "What's happening?" And I was like, "Oh, someone's just watching Lord of the Rings very, very loudly." I took evolutionary biology there. It was great.
Yeah, despite not having gone to the Claremont colleges, I somehow, like 50% of my friends as an adult have gone there. So I have a lot of other contacts who've been to all there as well.
It was a good network.
How did you decide on UCLA for grad school?
I didn't really. This is, and I don't know if you had other people talk about their like grad school journey in other sessions.
We haven't, yeah, well, we did in the lab that Elise is working in. The grad students from that lab talked about how they got there. But actually this kind of overlaps with something I was hoping you'd talk a little more about, because you had gone to Bali in between undergrad and grad school, and that's because you had a Fulbright fellowship, right? And so probably like how you decided like who to work with in your Fulbright then influenced going to UCLA, right?
Yeah. So in Uh, at some point in time that I can't remember in undergrad, I got a scholarship from Scripps to do summer research. And they said, you can do it with anyone you want. You can do it with someone here in Claremont, or you can do it with someone else elsewhere if you can find somebody who will take you. And I really wanted to do research in marine science. And no one at Claremont at the time was doing marine science. The one marine science faculty was retiring. And I just started emailing people in Boston, just cold emailing anybody who was doing marine science research at any university that was like within a reasonable distance from my parents' house. And one person emailed back, Paul Barber, who was at Boston University at the time, and he was like, "You have your own money? Sure, come do whatever you want. I don't have to pay you." But no, really, he had said, we run a summer program that takes students, undergrads, to Indonesia every summer to do marine science research. And like the application period for this summer has passed, but since you have your own funding, we can figure out how to get you to Indonesia, and you can do research with the group of interns for the summer. And so I said yes. It was hard to say no. And due to a lot of complications in permits and travel and lots of intergovernmental things, we didn't actually end up going to Indonesia. So we did our internship in Boston. But I kept in touch with Paul over the years. And then when at the end of undergrad, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I applied to some jobs. I, wasn't entirely sure where I wanted to go. I knew I didn't want to go back to school yet because I just finished school. And the Fulbright program was something that, the college sort of introduces to everyone if you want to apply. And I talked to Paul about it. And he was like, yeah, I mean, we're actually just about to go to Indonesia and like set up a lab there, like long term in collaboration with Indonesian universities. You could write your Fulbright to do research there and help out with that. And it all worked out in the end to do that. And so I moved there. And when I decided to go to grad school, right, I had said, I was like, well, I could stay here in Indo and I could be a dive master, or I guess, and then I was like, I guess I should take the GREs also, just in case, because like, the job stability of being a dive master could be not great. And as much as I love lying on the beach, maybe I don't love lying on the beach that much. And I wanted to do something with the research that I had. And so I applied to UCLA where Paul was, so that I could continue the research, really. So I didn't really look at other grad schools. I applied to Old Dominion in Virginia because one of our collaborators also worked there and I could continue the same research. And I think that's quite different from how a lot of people approach grad school, right? Like they really sort of figure out, like look at a lot of different labs, they research different programs. So I don't really know much about UCLA when I started. And then I ended up staying. So in some ways, right, like I ended up in an evolutionary biology department when I really wanted to work in applied conservation. And they were not exactly the best match, but I was lucky to have an advisor who was just like, yeah, if you're interested in it, spend the time to try and do it. Like still do your PhD research, but if you are interested in doing some side projects, like go for it. And that's how I was able to just, when the opportunity from Conservation International came along, I was just like, all right, sure, this seems like a great idea.
Yeah, and I took the more traditional path of, looking at, like I wanted to study evolution on coral reefs. And so I was looking around for different professors at different universities who were all studying that in some way, and applied to like 9 different grad schools. Didn't get into any of them. So that's part of my journey. And moved to the West Coast, loved it. Then I reapplied to only schools on the West Coast, and then I got into UCLA. So, I mean, that happens a lot, I think, where you kind of end up only getting into one grad school, but usually it's because it's the best match for you. And, like the professor, like feels like believes in you, and especially in biology, like it really comes down to the individual professors a lot of the time instead of like the school itself. And so if you have a bond with, kind of like form a relationship with someone and then apply to their lab, like the chances are you're going to get into their lab. And I know plenty of people who went to UCLA for undergrad and then stayed there for grad school, like continued to work with the person they had worked with in undergrad research. And so, I mean, that's the kind of thing. I know that like one of our ACE alums, Tony, had done his ACE internship with a professor at OHSU and then went to undergrad elsewhere, but now is coming back and going to do a grad program at OHSU. So having that connection really helped. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also what Allison's saying, also like finding someone you really want to work with is really important. I mean, it's kind of the same with college. Like I remember being so distraught that I didn't get into like these big name schools, and it's very heart-wrenching. Now I'm like, oh, that was silly. And I wasn't sure, like, the schools I did get into, I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't even know why I applied. Feel like you kind of like throw the dart at the wall and you're like, okay, I hope I get into college. But when I went to visit, I was like, oh, like I feel comfortable here. Like I feel like I wasn't even like nervous about talking to people because people were friendly, and it seemed like a place where I would make friends. And like I think we talk a lot about going, like making sure you take classes that are important for your career and like and whatnot, but like it is somewhere where you're gonna have to spend 4 years of your life, and it better be a place you're going to enjoy being there, even no matter what education you end up getting. And I think the same for grad school. It's like you're going to spend 5 years researching a pretty narrow topic, right? Like I spent 5 years deep in squid, and like sometimes it was really stressful. Just it was a lot of squid, and sometimes things didn't work. Sometimes like computers broke or the power went out that one time. That was awful. And I was like, my thesis is over. But having support, like having other grad students that you can call on, having an advisor that you feel comfortable talking to, right, and that supports you is really important. It sort of doesn't really, like, for Paul, right, I was like, well, I guess I would have gone to grad school wherever you worked. If it was in LA, even better, because I really wanted to move back to LA.
Yeah, I think that also goes to like, we've talked in other meetings about choosing or meeting mentors and kind of keeping up relationships with mentors who you liked working with. And I think, even though neither of us stayed in academia and, neither of us have a job that's similar to our PhD mentor, I think like, he's still a part of our lives, and like we update him, he updates us, like he's always like sending, so I think it just goes to show that keeping those relationships is useful. There's something else I was going to say about that though. About like finding, like we were really lucky that we had some like good friends who kind of all started grad school at the same time. Like I wish that for anyone who decides to go to grad school. But I think like leaning on each other, like, or, having interns that are in the same lab as you, for example. I hope that it's been really fun for you. But I really liked that part of grad school too, is like being in a lab with people that I really liked. And, we even like went to Hawaii for a few weeks to work in a lab there together, and just like,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So,
Which funnily enough, my old boss is now the director of that lab.
oh yeah.
For the museum.
But
yeah, I mean, that's one of the things too, right? It's like, I think once you go into the sort of the world of research or practice or whichever, you've actually ended up finding that it's pretty small. You run into the same people a lot. And it's those connections that I think are really important, right? Like, before I came to WF, I spent 2 years working for a project for the US government. And the only reason why I got involved is because the person who was running it, she and I had worked together on a different working group that I used to run. And, we were both in the same meeting in Kenya recently and got into this long conversation about the use of evidence in the US government. And then she was like, hey, we have this project. It'd be great if you were part of this. And, in some ways that can be bad for diversity, right? Because you need the opportunity to actually interact with those people. But at the same time, I think it's really useful to remember that, like, I think I got a lot of grad students even asking, they're like, what classes should I take? Like what should I make sure I have in my resume to get a job at a big NGO? And I'm like, to be perfectly honest, I don't think I've looked at anyone's CV like ever when they've applied for a job. Not ever, right? I still look at it, but it's like the last thing I look at. Like I'm looking at their cover letter and trying to understand like what makes them excited. But then also looking at their letters of recommendation, like who's worked with them and do they think that they're a good person to work with, right? Like, are they going to be a person who's going to be agreeable and respectful in the workplace, and fun, right? Because I think that's always the challenge is that part of it. So keeping in touch with people you work with, I think, is really important.
Yeah. And any other questions? I think I'll also just point out, did you have one? Sorry. That, we talked to a med student as our first lunch and learn. And although, a lot of med students also majored in biology, that's during college, a similar experience to Sam. If you then pursue the medical route, you do end up taking a lot of exams throughout your career. So there's a lot of exams during med school, during residency, during fellowship. One of my good friends, she's a hand surgeon. She's, an fully employed doctor done with her actual training, but she just had to take her medical board exam like yet again yesterday. Just like you keep getting tested, which if you like that kind of style of like doing a lot of studying and test taking and kind of keep following those things, that is great. If you don't want to have to take a lot of tests, then the nice thing about other biology routes is pretty much like after you're done with undergrad, and there's like one or two big exams in grad school, and then you're kind of just like, after that point, grades, tests like are irrelevant, and it's kind of freeing to get away from that. But both routes are great.
And there are lots of other ones too, right? Like a lot of people I work with now, like who are professionals in conservation. Like I had a call this morning with someone who works in the UK, who does similar things that I do. And he was a French literature major in college. I mean, admittedly, after he was like, yeah, I was also like, this was fun, but I'm not sure what one does with French literature. And then, he did a bunch of other stuff. He worked in international development. And I have another good friend who's now a scientist with, I think, US Fish and Wildlife, somewhere in the Midwest. And she came into population genetics from working in marketing. And she was in marketing for a long time and was just taking night classes for fun because she was like, fish are cool. I'm going to take a night class in fish. Met her PhD advisor and was like, I'm going back to school for fish biodiversity. So like you can come into conservation and biology from lots of different places. And I think it actually kind of helps because it gives you like that bigger picture in some ways of like, because when we work in conservation, it's not just with biology, it's about social science, it's about political science, it's about people's behaviors and all sorts of stuff. And also marketing, right? We have a whole, like, I just found out yesterday that we have, what is it called? A global celebrity steering committee or something like that. And I was just like, what is this committee and how do I be on it? And they were like, it's sort of outside of your realm. But it's, working to build awareness about conservation through, public figures or celebrities.
Yeah, that reminds me, another interesting thing about being in LA for school is that you kind of had more, there just tend to be more like events and things like that do have an intersection with like the entertainment world. So for example, our advisor Paul was part of an exhibit that got created for an aquarium down there, and our science center, and for each like part of the exhibit there was a musician who was composing a like a song. I don't really remember the details, but I think like Jack Johnson was like his musician, and which is kind of funny. Like Paul is like a surfer guy and is like very similar, I think, to Jack Johnson in terms of I don't know if any of you know who Jack Johnson is, but he's like a Hawaiian singer-songwriter. So anyway, it's like a cool collaboration that Paul got to do as a marine biologist.
And you can definitely take your biology knowledge, right? Or whatever type of knowledge it is, and take it to other places too, right? Like we have social media teams who, you know, help us interpret and communicate scientific knowledge. You know, sometimes scientists are not great at talking to the public, make it really complicated. And you know, people work as science communicators. And you know, just, you know, working in business, right? Like lots now, the biggest partnerships that we run are partnerships with private companies like Coca-Cola, and like sustainability officers at organizations, at companies like that, right, are using their science knowledge in a different way to help them figure out how they make sure their company is doing things sustainably.
Yeah. All right. Any last questions for Sam? Okay.
Good luck with your project.
Yeah, and thank you, Sam, for your beautiful talk. I always love your slides the most, and sharing your story. And thank you to all the students who came today.
Thanks, guys. Feel free to email me if you have any questions about anything.
Yeah, I can hook you up if you want to be in touch with Sam.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day and a good weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.